The letter trembled in Caroline Abbott's hands as she stood on the porch of her late father's ranch house, her rounded belly visible beneath her simple cotton dress. And she knew that by sundown tomorrow, she would have to surrender the child growing inside her to the couple from San Antonio or face complete ruin. It was August 1878 in Gonzales, Texas, and the summer heat pressed down on everything like a physical weight, making the air shimmer above the dusty road that stretched toward town. Her father had died 3 months ago, leaving debts she could never repay on her own, and the bank had made it clear that a woman in her condition, unmarried and alone, had no business trying to run a cattle ranch. The lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, had arranged everything with cold efficiency. A wealthy merchant and his barren wife would take the baby the moment it was born, paying enough to settle her debts and leave her with a small sum to start over somewhere far from Texas, somewhere she could pretend none of this had ever happened. Caroline pressed her palm against her belly, feeling the flutter of movement beneath her skin. 5 months along, and already she loved this child more than she thought possible. The father, a charming drifter named Billy who had worked on the ranch last spring, had disappeared the moment she told him about the baby. She had been foolish and young and so desperate for affection after her mother's death the previous winter that she had believed his promises. Now she was 22 years old and facing a future that felt like a slow death. Giving up her child, living with that emptiness forever. The thought made her chest tighten until she could barely breathe. She folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, then walked down the porch steps toward the barn. The ranch was small, just 60 acres with maybe 30 head of cattle, but it had been in her family since before she was born. Her father had worked himself into an early grave trying to keep it running after her mother died, and now it would all be sold to pay his debts anyway. The injustice of it burned in her throat. If she had been born male, the bank would have given her time, would have worked with her. But a woman alone, pregnant and unwed, was seen as nothing more than a scandal to be quietly resolved. The barn was cooler than the house, shadowy and smelling of hay and horses. Caroline had 2 horses left, having sold the others to buy food and keep the ranch going these past months. She ran her hand along the neck of her father's old gelding, finding comfort in the solid warmth of the animal. She would have to sell him too, along with everything else. The thought made tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had cried enough over the past weeks. Crying changed nothing. She heard hoofbeats on the road and walked to the barn entrance, shading her eyes against the bright sunlight. A rider was approaching, sitting tall in the saddle on a paint horse. As he drew closer, she could make out a broad-brimmed hat, dusty trail clothes, and the easy posture of a man who spent more time on horseback than on his feet. He slowed as he reached her property line, then turned up the path toward the house. Caroline's hand instinctively went to the rifle that hung just inside the barn door, but she did not reach for it yet. The rider did not look threatening, just travel-worn and tired. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from the barn and touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice deep and unhurried. "Name is Morgan Vance. I heard in town that this ranch might be hiring, looking for work if you have any." Caroline studied him more carefully. He was probably in his mid-20s, with sun-darkened skin and lines around his eyes from squinting into too many bright horizons. His clothes were worn but clean, and his horse was well cared for. He had an honest face, she thought, though she had been wrong about such things before. "You heard wrong," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I am not hiring. The ranch is being sold." Morgan Vance tilted his head slightly, his gaze taking in the property, the barn that needed repair, the fence posts that were starting to lean. Then his eyes came back to her, and she saw the moment he noticed her condition. His expression did not change, did not show judgment or curiosity, just a quiet acknowledgement. "Sorry to hear that," he said. "It is a good piece of land. Seems a shame to let it go." "I do not have much choice in the matter," Caroline said, her voice sharper than she intended. "My father died with debts, and I cannot run the ranch alone." Morgan was quiet for a moment, his hands resting easy on the saddle horn. "What if you would help?" A hand who would work for room and board until the ranch was back on its feet. Caroline almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "And why would anyone do that? There is no money to pay wages, and the bank will take the property in 3 months regardless." 3 months is enough time to prove the ranch can be profitable, Morgan said. "Enough time to convince a bank to extend credit. I have done it before, helped turn around struggling operations. I know cattle and I know horses, and I am a fair hand at fixing things that are broken." She wanted to tell him no, to send him on his way, but something in his manner made her hesitate. He was not looking at her with pity or calculation. He was looking at her like she was a person with a problem that might have a solution, and that was so different from how everyone else in town looked at her these days that it made her throat tight. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "What do you get out of this?" Morgan shrugged. "Honest work, a place to stay, and the satisfaction of seeing something worth saving get saved. I have been drifting for too long. Might be nice to put down roots for a while, see if I can make a difference somewhere." Caroline wanted to believe him, but trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I cannot pay you anything. Not now, maybe not ever if the bank still takes the ranch." "I understand that," Morgan said. "I am offering anyway." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing her options. She could send him away and continue trying to manage everything alone, knowing she would fail. She could give up now, sign the papers, and surrender everything including the child she already loved. Or she could take a chance on a stranger who might be genuine or might be just another man looking to take advantage of her vulnerability. "The bunkhouse needs cleaning, but it is sound," she finally said. "There is not much food, but I will share what I have. If you are serious about this, you can start tomorrow." Morgan touched his hat brim again. "I am serious, madam, and I will start today if you will show me what needs doing first." That was how Morgan Vance came into Caroline Abbott's life, riding up her dusty road on a paint horse with nothing but a saddle bag of belongings and an offer that seemed too good to be true. She showed him the bunkhouse, which was indeed dusty but structurally sound, and then walked him around the property, pointing out everything that needed attention. The list was long and overwhelming. Fences to mend, cattle to round up from the far pastures where they had wandered, the barn roof that leaked, the well that was starting to go dry and needed to be dug deeper. Morgan listened to everything without complaint, just nodding and occasionally asking a practical question. By the time the sun was setting, he had already started work on the most critical fence repairs, moving with an efficiency that spoke of long experience. Caroline made a simple supper of beans and cornbread, and they ate in awkward silence at the kitchen table, the first time she had shared a meal with anyone since her father's death. "How far along are you?" Morgan asked finally, his tone carefully neutral. Caroline's hand went instinctively to her belly. 5 months, the baby should come in January, and the father, gone, she said flatly. "He left when I told him." Morgan nodded slowly, his jaw tightening slightly. "That was a coward's choice." "Yes," Caroline agreed. "But it does not change my situation. I have been told I must give the baby up for adoption. A couple from San Antonio has already agreed to take the child. The lawyer says it is the only sensible option." She watched Morgan's reaction carefully, expecting to see agreement or at least understanding of the practical realities. Instead, she saw his expression harden into something almost fierce. "Who says you must give up your child?" he asked quietly. "Who has the right to make that decision for you?" "Everyone," Caroline said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts to stay composed. "The bank, the lawyer, the people in town who whisper behind their hands. I cannot raise a child alone with no money and no home. What kind of life would that be for a baby?" "Better than growing up without knowing their mother," Morgan said with unexpected intensity. "Better than you spending the rest of your life wondering about the child you gave away." Caroline felt tears spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. "What choice do I have? I will lose the ranch anyway. I have nothing to offer a child." Morgan leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "You have love. That is more than a lot of children get. And if the ranch is the problem, then we fix the ranch. 3 months. Give me 3 months to turn this place around, to show the bank it is worth saving. Give yourself a chance to keep your child. And if we fail," Caroline whispered, "if the bank takes the ranch anyway and I still have nothing, then we will figure something out," Morgan said. "But you will still have your child, and that will matter more than any piece of land." Caroline stared at him, this stranger who had ridden into her life just hours ago and was now talking about saving her ranch and her future with a conviction that made her almost believe it was possible. "Why do you care? You do not even know me." Morgan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the table. "My mother gave me up when I was born," he said finally. "She was young and alone, and someone convinced her it was the right thing to do. I grew up in an orphanage in St. Louis, and it was not a bad life exactly, but there was always this emptiness, this wondering why I was not wanted. I would not wish that feeling on any child, and I would not wish the regret on any mother. So yes, I care. Maybe more than makes sense for a stranger, but I care." Caroline felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. She had been so alone for so long, carrying the weight of her shame and her impossible situation with no one to share the burden. Now here was this man, this cowboy with kind eyes and a painful past of his own, offering her hope when she had thought there was none left. 3 months, she said, her voice stronger now. "We have until November before the bank forecloses. If you can really help turn this ranch around, if there is any chance I can keep my child, then I will take it." Morgan smiled for the first time, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and less careworn. "Then we start first thing in the morning. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." The days that followed blurred together in a haze of hard work and determination. Morgan proved to be everything he had claimed and more. He rose before dawn and worked until well after sunset, repairing fences and buildings, rounding up the scattered cattle, and making a dozen improvements that Caroline had not even known were possible. He taught her how to keep proper books so they could track every penny and prove to the bank that the ranch was viable. He rode into town and negotiated a better price for their beef with the butcher, charming the man with easy conversation and practical knowledge. Caroline worked alongside him as much as her pregnancy allowed, cooking meals, tending the vegetable garden that had gone wild, and handling the lighter ranch tasks. She found herself watching Morgan when he did not know she was looking, noticing the way he moved with unconscious grace, the patience he showed with the animals, the way he never complained about the brutal heat or the endless list of tasks that needed doing. They talked more as the days passed, sharing stories of their lives during meals and evening hours when the work finally stopped. Morgan told her about growing up in the orphanage, about the tough superintendent who had nevertheless taught him to read and write, about leaving at 16 to find work and wandering westward ever since. He had worked on ranches across Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma before drifting down into Texas. He was 26 years old, had never been married, and carried an old bullet wound in his left shoulder from a cattle rustling incident in Dodge City, where he had tried to stop thieves from stealing his employer's herd. Caroline told him about growing up on the ranch, about her mother who had loved books and taught her to read from the family Bible, about her father who had been stern but loving in his way. She told him about the loneliness after her mother died, about Billy's sweet lies and quick departure, about the crushing weight of shame and fear she had carried these past months. "You should not feel shame," Morgan said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. "You loved someone who did not deserve it. That is his failing, not yours." "The people in town do not see it that way," Caroline said. "When I go to church, they move away from me like I have a disease. Mrs. Henderson actually crossed the street last week to avoid speaking to me." "Then they are fools," Morgan said with quiet conviction. "You are one of the strongest people I have ever met, carrying on when most would have given up. Your child is lucky to have you as a mother." Caroline felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had been starving for kindness, for someone to see her as more than just a scandal or a problem to be solved. Morgan saw her, really saw her, and did not turn away. As August faded into September, the ranch began to show real signs of improvement. The fences were all repaired, the barn roof was patched, and the cattle were rounded up and healthier than they had been in months. Morgan had even managed to breed 2 of the cows with a neighbor's bull, ensuring calves in the spring. The vegetable garden was producing again, and Caroline had started putting up preserves for the winter. More importantly, they had started to feel like a team, moving around each other with growing familiarity and ease. Morgan learned that Caroline liked her coffee strong and her breakfast early. Caroline learned that Morgan had a dry sense of humor that emerged at unexpected moments, and that he could not carry a tune but hummed anyway while he worked. They developed routines and rhythms, small domestic patterns that made the ranch feel less like a burden and more like a home. Caroline tried not to think too much about what would happen when the 3 months were up, whether the bank would be impressed enough to extend her credit, whether she would be allowed to keep her child. She tried not to think about what would happen with Morgan, whether he would stay or drift on to the next job once his work here was done. But late at night, lying in her bed with her hand on her growing belly, she could not help imagining a future that included all 3 of them, her and Morgan and the baby, making a life together on this land that had been in her family for generations. One warm September evening, Morgan came back from town with supplies and an unusually somber expression. Caroline met him at the barn, immediately sensing that something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked as he dismounted. Morgan tied his horse and turned to face her. "I ran into your lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, at the general store. He asked me about the ranch, wanted to know if I was the new hand you had hired. I told him I was helping out, working to get the place back on its feet." "What did he say?" "He said it was a waste of effort. That the bank had already made up their mind to foreclose, and that no amount of improvement would change that. He said I was giving you false hope." Morgan's jaw was tight with anger. "He also reminded me that you had agreed to give up the baby, that the couple from San Antonio was expecting to take the child in January." Caroline felt her stomach drop. She had been trying not to think about that letter, about the promise she had made before Morgan arrived. "I signed a paper," she said quietly. "Not a legal contract, but a letter of intent. Pemberton said it would show good faith, that it would help with the debts." "Do you want to give up your baby?" Morgan asked, stepping closer to her. "Is that what you want?" "No," Caroline said. the word bursting out of her with more force than she intended. "No, I want to keep my child. I want to raise them here on this land. I want to give them the life my parents gave me, full of hard work and clean air and knowing they are loved." But wanting something does not make it possible. Morgan reached out and took her hands in his grip warm and solid. What if it was possible? What if you had someone to help you, not just with the ranch, but with everything? Someone to stand beside you and tell the bank and the lawyer and the whole damn town that you are keeping your child and they can go to hell if they have a problem with it. Caroline's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Morgan, what are you saying?" He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "I am saying that I have fallen in love with you, Caroline Abbott. I did not plan it and I probably have no right to it, but it is the truth. I love your strength and your stubbornness, and the way you keep fighting even when everything is against you. I love the way you talk to the horses and the way you burn cornbread sometimes, but keep trying anyway. I love that you are willing to fight for your child even when everyone tells you to give up." Caroline felt tears streaming down her face, her breath coming in short gasps. "I am carrying another man's child. How can you love me? That baby is part of you, so how could I not love them too?" Morgan said simply, "If you will let me, I will raise that child as my own. I will be the father they deserve, and I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you both. Marry me, Caroline. Let me stand beside you and help you fight for the life you want. Let me be the family you and your baby need." She wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to fall into his arms and accept the miracle he was offering. But doubt held her back, all the practical concerns and fears she had lived with for too long. What if the bank still forecloses? What if we lose everything anyway? "Then we will start over somewhere else," Morgan said. "I have 2 hands and a strong back. You have courage and determination. Together we can build a life anywhere. But I would rather fight for this ranch, for your family's legacy, and know we tried everything than give up before the battle is even finished." "What if you change your mind?" Caroline whispered. "What if you wake up one day and regret taking on another man's child?" Morgan lifted one hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. "I will not. I swear to you I will not. I know what it feels like to grow up without parents, and I know what I am offering. I want this, Caroline. I want you and the baby and the ranch and all the hard work and struggle that comes with it. I want to build something lasting, something real. Say yes. Please say yes." Caroline searched his face and saw only honesty and hope and a love so fierce it took her breath away. She thought about the alternative, about giving up her child and living with that loss forever, about trying to face the future alone. Then she thought about this man who had ridden into her life, like an answer to a prayer she had been afraid to speak aloud, who worked from dawn to dusk with no promise of payment, who looked at her pregnant belly and saw not shame but possibility. "Yes," she said, the word coming out choked with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes to all of it." Morgan pulled her into his arms, careful of her belly, and held her like she was something precious and fragile and worth protecting. Caroline buried her face in his shoulder and wept, not from sadness but from overwhelming relief and joy, and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher who came through Gonzales on his monthly rounds. It was a simple ceremony in the church with only a handful of witnesses, mostly people who had been kind to Caroline during her difficulties. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit over her pregnancy, and Morgan wore a new shirt he had purchased in town for the occasion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Morgan kissed her with such tenderness that Caroline felt her heart might burst from happiness. The next day, they rode together into town to meet with Mr. Pemberton. The lawyer was visibly surprised to see them walk into his office together, Caroline with her head held high and Morgan's hand firmly wrapped around hers. "Mrs. Vance and I are here to discuss the ranch," Morgan said, deliberately using Caroline's new name. "We have been working to improve the property over the past month, and we believe we can demonstrate that it is financially viable. We would like the bank to extend the loan rather than foreclose." Pemberton leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "Mr. Vance, I appreciate your optimism, but the situation has not changed. Mrs. Abbott, I mean Mrs. Vance, still has considerable debt and no real income. 1 month of improvements cannot erase that reality. We have detailed records of all improvements made and projected income from cattle sales," Morgan said, sliding a ledger across the desk. "We have also secured a contract with the butcher in town for regular beef deliveries and have breeding stock that will produce calves in the spring. The ranch can support itself and pay down the debt over time." Pemberton flipped through the ledger with obvious reluctance, but Caroline could see his expression shift as he read Morgan's carefully compiled numbers. "This is more organized than I expected," he admitted. "But it still does not guarantee success. Ranching is unpredictable. Drought, disease, any number of things could destroy these projections." "That is true of any ranch," Morgan countered. "But the land is good, the cattle are healthy, and we are both committed to making this work. All we are asking is for a fair chance." "And what about the baby?" Pemberton asked, turning his attention to Caroline. "You signed a letter of intent to surrender the child to the Hamiltons in San Antonio. They have been making preparations, buying things for a nursery. They are expecting to take custody when the child is born." Caroline felt Morgan's hand tighten on hers, giving her strength. "I have changed my mind," she said clearly. "I am keeping my baby. Mr. Vance is my husband now, and we will raise the child together." "The Hamiltons will be very disappointed," Pemberton said with obvious disapproval. "They may even pursue legal action." "Let them try," Morgan said, his voice hard. "That letter was not a binding contract. My wife has the right to raise her own child, and I will stand beside her against anyone who tries to take that right away." Pemberton looked between them, clearly reassessing the situation. "I will speak to the bank about the loan extension," he finally said, "but I cannot make any promises. They may still decide to foreclose regardless of your improvements." "That is all we ask," Morgan said. "A fair consideration of the facts." They left the office with no guarantees, but Caroline felt lighter than she had in months. She had a husband who loved her, a plan to save her ranch, and the hope that she might actually be able to keep her baby. It was more than she had dared to imagine just a few weeks ago. The weeks that followed were both wonderful and terrifying. Wonderful because Caroline was learning what it meant to be truly partnered with someone, to share burdens and joys and the small intimacies of daily life. Morgan moved his few belongings into the main house, and they began to build a life together. He was patient with her fears and insecurities, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but always there with steady support and quiet affection. The terrifying part was waiting to hear from the bank, wondering if all their hard work would be enough. Morgan continued to make improvements to the ranch, and Caroline worked alongside him as much as her growing belly allowed. By October, she was 7 months along and moving more slowly, but she refused to stop helping entirely. The baby was active now, kicking and rolling, and sometimes at night Morgan would place his hand on her belly and marvel at the life growing beneath her skin. "Have you thought about names?" he asked one evening as they lay in bed together, his palm warm against her stomach. "Some," Caroline admitted. "If it is a girl, I thought maybe Catherine after my mother. If it is a boy." She trailed off, uncertainty filling her. If it is a boy, what about William? Morgan suggested. We could call him Will, it is a strong name. William Vance, Caroline said, testing the sound of it. I like that. But Morgan, are you sure? This baby is not yours by blood. You do not have to claim them as your own. Morgan rolled onto his side to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight streaming through the window. The moment we married, this baby became mine in every way that matters. Blood does not make a father. Love and commitment and showing up every day to do the hard work of raising a child, that is what makes a father. I will be there for every scraped knee and bad dream and important moment. I will teach them to ride and rope and read and be a good person. I will love them as fiercely as I love you. Never doubt that. Caroline pulled him close, overwhelmed by emotion. She had never expected to find this kind of love, this absolute certainty that someone would stand by her no matter what. I love you, she whispered against his chest. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I love you so much it scares me sometimes. You do not have to do anything to deserve love, Morgan said, stroking her hair. You just have to be willing to accept it when it finds you. In late October, they finally received word from the bank. Mr. Pemberton came to the ranch personally to deliver the news, and Caroline's heart was in her throat as she and Morgan stood together on the porch waiting to hear their fate. The bank has reviewed your proposal and the records Mr. Vance provided, Pemberton said, his tone formal. They have agreed to extend the loan for 1 year, with the condition that you make regular monthly payments and continue to demonstrate that the ranch is profitable. If you default at any point, they will foreclose immediately without further consideration. Caroline felt her knees go weak with relief, and Morgan's arm came around her waist to steady her. We understand, he said, and we will meet those conditions. Thank you for advocating for us. Pemberton nodded stiffly. I hope you succeed, Mrs. Vance, for your sake and the child's. He paused, then added grudgingly, You have done impressive work here in just a few months. The ranch looks better than it has in years. After the lawyer left, Caroline turned to Morgan and threw her arms around his neck, laughing and crying at the same time. We did it, she said. We actually did it. The ranch is ours, at least for now, and I can keep my baby. Morgan lifted her off her feet, spinning her around carefully. Our baby, he corrected. And yes, we did it. I told you we could. You did, Caroline agreed, looking up at him with shining eyes. You rode into my life and changed everything. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me love when I thought I was unlovable. How do I ever thank you for that? You do not thank me, Morgan said, lowering her gently back to the ground. You just keep being you, keep fighting for what matters, keep letting me love you. That is all I need. 2 months later, on a cold January morning in 1879, Caroline went into labor. Morgan had brought the doctor from town the day before, sensing that the baby was coming soon, and now he paced the kitchen while the doctor and the midwife attended to Caroline in the bedroom. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, and every cry of pain from his wife made Morgan's chest tighten with helpless worry. Finally, as the sun was setting and casting long shadows across the ranch, he heard a different sound. The thin, reedy wail of a newborn baby filled the house, and Morgan's legs nearly gave out from relief. A few minutes later, the midwife emerged from the bedroom with a smile on her weathered face. You have a son, she announced. A healthy boy with strong lungs. Your wife did well. She wants to see you now. Morgan walked into the bedroom on shaking legs and stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sight before him. Caroline was propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, with a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket cradled in her arms. She looked up as he entered, and her smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Morgan crossed to the bed and sat carefully on the edge, looking down at the small red face peeking out from the blanket. The baby had stopped crying and was making small, snuffling sounds, his tiny fist waving near his mouth. Morgan felt something crack open in his chest, a rush of love so powerful it made his eyes sting with tears. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect, both of you." "William Morgan Vance," Caroline said, placing the baby carefully in Morgan's arms. "Will for short. Do you approve?" Morgan looked down at the baby in his arms, this tiny person who had not existed in the world an hour ago and who now depended on them for everything. He thought about his own childhood, growing up without parents, always wondering if he had been wanted. He made a silent promise to this child that he would never have to wonder. He would know every day of his life that he was loved and wanted and valued beyond measure. "I approve," Morgan said, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome to the world, Will. Your mother and I are going to do our best to make it a good one for you." The months that followed were exhausting but joyful in ways Morgan had never experienced before. They took turns walking the floor with Will when he cried at night, changed countless diapers, and marveled at every small development. Caroline recovered quickly from the birth, her body bouncing back with the resilience of youth and good health. By the time Will was 2 months old, she was back to helping with ranch work, though she now had to balance those duties with caring for an infant. Morgan discovered that he loved being a father. He loved the weight of Will in his arms, the way the baby would calm at the sound of his voice, the first time those unfocused blue eyes seemed to really see him, and a toothless smile appeared. He built a cradle from smooth oak wood and carved their initials into the headboard. He sat in the rocking chair Caroline's mother had used and sang lullabies in his rough voice while Will drifted off to sleep. The ranch continued to thrive under their combined efforts. They made their monthly payments to the bank on time, and by spring, they even had a little money saved. The cattle breeding program Morgan had started produced healthy calves, and they were able to expand their herd. They hired a young ranch hand named Tommy to help with some of the heavier work, paying him a modest wage from their profits. As Will grew from an infant into a chubby, cheerful baby who babbled and laughed and pulled himself up to standing, Caroline and Morgan's love for each other deepened. They had been forged in crisis, brought together by necessity, but what they had built was real and lasting. They worked as partners in all things, making decisions together, supporting each other through difficulties, celebrating victories no matter how small. One evening in late summer, when Will was 8 months old and crawling around the kitchen floor exploring everything within reach, Caroline stood at the stove making dinner and felt Morgan's arms come around her from behind. She leaned back against his chest, comfortable in his embrace. "I have been thinking," Morgan said, his voice rumbling against her back, "about the future, about our family." "What about it?" Caroline asked, stirring the pot of stew. "I was wondering if you might want more children someday, brothers or sisters for Will. This house feels like it could hold a lot more love and laughter." Caroline turned in his arms to face him, seeing the hope and slight uncertainty in his eyes. "Are you asking if I want to have your baby?" "I suppose I am," Morgan admitted. "Only if you want to, of course. I know carrying Will and giving birth was not easy. But if you wanted more children, children that are ours together from the start, I would like that very much." Caroline reached up to cup his face, her heart swelling with love for this man who had given her everything she thought she had lost. "I want that too," she said. "I want to fill this house with children who know they are loved, who grow up watching their parents work together and support each other. I want to give Will siblings to play with and confide in. I want to build a family with you, Morgan Vance, a real family that lasts." Morgan kissed her then, deep and sweet and full of promise. Will made a babbling sound from the floor, and they both laughed, breaking apart to look down at their son, who was pulling himself up using the table leg and grinning at them with 4 tiny teeth showing. "I think he approves," Morgan said, scooping the baby up and tossing him gently in the air. Will shrieked with delight, and Caroline felt her eyes fill with happy tears at the sight of her husband and son together. By the time Will turned 2 in January of 1881, Caroline was pregnant again. This time there was no fear or shame attached to her growing belly, only joy and anticipation. Morgan was even more protective than before, insisting she rest more and take on fewer heavy tasks. He talked to her stomach at night, telling the baby about their ranch and their family, and all the adventures waiting in the world. Their daughter was born in September of 1881, a tiny thing with a full head of dark hair and her father's gray eyes. They named her Catherine Rose, Kate for short, after Caroline's mother, and because the name felt right. Will was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything and bringing her his favorite toys to examine. The ranch continued to prosper. By 1882, they had paid down enough of the original debt that the bank finally agreed to a permanent loan extension with much better terms. They were no longer in danger of losing the property, and Morgan's dream of putting down roots had become a reality. They added onto the house, building more bedrooms for their growing family and a larger kitchen where they could all gather for meals. Over the next several years, 2 more children joined the Vance family. A son they named Henry in 1883 and another daughter they named Sarah in 1885. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sounds of children laughing and playing, with the daily chaos of a large family living and growing together. Morgan proved to be a wonderful father to all the children, but Caroline noticed that he had a special bond with Will. Perhaps it was because Will had been the first, or perhaps it was because Morgan remembered his promise to raise him as his own. Whatever the reason, the connection between father and son was deep and genuine. Will followed Morgan around the ranch from the time he could walk, learning to ride and rope and care for the animals. He never questioned that Morgan was his father in every way that mattered, because Morgan never treated him differently than the other children. When Will was 7 years old and starting to ask questions about where babies came from and how families worked, Caroline and Morgan decided it was time to tell him the truth about his biological father. They chose a quiet evening when the other children were already in bed and sat with Will in the parlor. "There is something we need to talk to you about," Caroline began, her heart racing with anxiety. "Something about our family and how you came to be part of it." Will looked between his parents with wide eyes, clearly sensing this was important. "Am I in trouble?" "No, sweetheart, not at all," Caroline assured him. "We just want you to know something about when you were born, about who your father is." Morgan took over, his voice calm and steady. "Will, I love you more than anything in this world. You are my son in every way that matters. But before I met your mother, before I came to this ranch, there was another man. He was your mother's friend, and he is the reason you exist. But he left before you were born, and he has never been part of your life." Will processed this slowly, his young face thoughtful. "So you are not my real father." "I am your real father," Morgan said firmly. "A father is not just the man whose blood you carry. A father is the man who raises you, who teaches you right from wrong, who loves you and protects you and is there for you every single day. I chose to be your father, Will, and I have never regretted that choice for 1 second." "Why did the other man leave?" Will asked, looking at Caroline now. "Because he was not ready to be a father," Caroline said honestly. "He was scared and he made a bad choice. But his bad choice led me to your father, the man sitting beside you now, and it gave us the family we have today. So I cannot regret what happened because it brought us to where we are now." Will was quiet for a long moment, then he turned to Morgan. "Do I have to call you something different now? Instead of Papa?" Morgan pulled the boy into his arms, holding him tight. "You call me whatever feels right to you. But I hope you will keep calling me Papa because that is what I am and always will be." "Then nothing has changed," Will said simply. "You are still my Papa, and Mama is still my Mama, and Kate and Henry and Sarah are still my brother and sisters. We are still a family." "Yes," Morgan said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are still a family, and we always will be." The years continued to roll by with the steady rhythm of ranch life. The children grew tall and strong, learning to work the land and care for the animals. Will developed his father's skill with horses and his mother's head for numbers, keeping the ranch books by the time he was 12. Kate was fearless and adventurous, always climbing trees and racing her brothers. Henry was quiet and thoughtful, preferring books to roping but pulling his weight nonetheless. Sarah was the baby, charming everyone with her bright personality and quick smile. Caroline and Morgan grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They faced hardships, as all ranchers did. There were years of drought and years of harsh winters. There were injuries and illnesses and the constant worry of whether they would have enough money to see them through. But they faced everything together, leaning on each other and on the strong family they had built. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1888, Morgan took Caroline on a rare trip away from the ranch, leaving the older children to watch the younger ones for a weekend. They rode to San Antonio and stayed in a hotel, spending 2 days just being together without the demands of the ranch and children constantly calling for their attention. On their last evening, as they walked through the town square in the warm twilight, Morgan stopped and turned to Caroline. "Do you remember when I first rode up to your ranch? You were standing in the barn, pregnant and scared and so determined not to let anyone see how much you were hurting." "I remember," Caroline said. "I thought you were crazy, offering to work for no pay on a ranch that was about to be foreclosed. I nearly sent you away." "I am glad you did not," Morgan said with a smile, "because these past 10 years have been the best of my life. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You gave me everything I did not know I was looking for. You saved me," Caroline said simply. "You saved me and my baby when I thought there was no hope left. You loved me when I could not love myself. You built a life with me that is better than anything I could have imagined." Morgan pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold necklace with a small diamond pendant. "I know we did not have much money when we got married, and I could not afford a proper wedding ring. I have been saving for a while, and I wanted to give you something to show you how much you mean to me." Caroline felt tears streaming down her face as Morgan fastened the necklace around her throat. "It is beautiful," she whispered, "but you did not have to do this. I have never needed jewelry to know that you love me." "I know," Morgan said, "but I wanted to anyway. I wanted you to have something beautiful because you deserve beautiful things. You deserve everything good this world has to offer." They kissed under the darkening sky, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. When they returned to the ranch the next day, they were greeted by their 4 children running out to meet them, all talking at once about everything that had happened while they were gone. Caroline looked around at her family, at the ranch that was thriving, at the life she and Morgan had created together, and felt a profound sense of gratitude and peace. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. Will grew into a fine young man, eventually taking on more responsibility for running the ranch as Morgan and Caroline grew older. When he was 20, he met a young woman named Elizabeth Turner at a church social, and Morgan and Caroline watched their eldest son fall in love with the same wholehearted devotion they had shown each other. Will and Elizabeth married in 1894 and built a house on the far corner of the ranch property, staying close to family while building their own life together. Kate surprised everyone by announcing at 18 that she wanted to become a teacher. She attended normal school in San Antonio and returned to Gonzales to teach at the local school, eventually marrying the new doctor who came to town in 1896. Henry took over managing the ranch finances and proved to have a gift for business, finding new markets for their cattle and negotiating contracts that brought in more money than they had ever made before. Sarah, the youngest, had her father's way with horses and her mother's fierce determination. She dreamed of breeding and training horses professionally, and by the time she was 20, she was doing exactly that on a portion of the ranch set aside for her operation. Morgan and Caroline watched their children build their own lives and families, becoming grandparents multiple times over. The ranch that had once been on the verge of foreclosure had grown into a thriving operation that employed several hands and provided a good living for multiple generations of Vances. More importantly, it had become a true family home, a place where love and hard work and commitment meant more than blood or circumstances of birth. On a warm spring evening in 1904, Caroline and Morgan sat together on the porch they had repaired so many years ago, watching the sun set over land they had fought to keep. They were in their 50s now, their hair graying and their faces lined with the marks of years spent working under the Texas sun. But when Morgan looked at Caroline, he still saw the young woman who had stood in her barn, determined not to show her fear. And when Caroline looked at Morgan, she still saw the cowboy who had ridden into her life and changed everything. "You ever regret it?" Caroline asked, her hand in his. "Taking on a pregnant woman and a failing ranch and all the struggles that came with it?" Morgan turned to her, his gray eyes still as clear and honest as they had been the day they met. "Not for one single second. You and our family are the best thing that ever happened to me. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." "I love you," Caroline said, the words as true now as they had been 26 years ago when she had first said them. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Morgan replied, pulling her close. "My wife, my partner, my best friend. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for taking a chance on a drifting cowboy who had nothing to offer but his heart and his willingness to work." They sat together as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, surrounded by the sounds of their ranch, their family, their life. In the distance, they could hear Will calling to his own children, teaching them the same lessons Morgan had taught him years ago. The circle continued, generation after generation, built on a foundation of love that had begun with a simple offer from a stranger. "Keep your child. I will raise them as mine." And Morgan had kept that promise, raising Will and all their children with devotion and love, building a family that would last long after he and Caroline were gone. It was a legacy worth more than any amount of money or land. A legacy of showing up and doing the hard work and choosing love, even when circumstances seemed impossible. It was the legacy of a cowboy who had found his home and a woman who had found her strength. And together, they had created something beautiful and lasting in the wild heart of Texas.